All right, we are gonna finish up chapter 18 because we're gonna look at section 3. We previously finished up section 2, which went over the course of the war, kind of just the big battles that took place in the basics. We concluded by saying that VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, was May 8th, 1945, and then Victory in Japan, VJ Day, was September 2nd, 1945. So the final section in this chapter is the consequences of the war. Just like we looked at with World War I, obviously any major conflict is going to have some sort of consequence for the world going forward. And so we're going to identify several different things that resulted from World War II. The first thing we're going to look at is the Holocaust. Now, that's a little bit out of order in your book. If you're in your book, this is going to be in the purple box on page 343. I have this first in the notes because normally we would do this and then we would take a couple days in class to dive into some more depth of the Holocaust than your book covers. So for today, we're just going to go through the notes that are from the textbook. We are going to talk a little bit more about the Holocaust, but I'm going to wait and do it next week, actually. The last week of school, that'll just kind of be our wrap up. For history will be just a little bit more information on the Holocaust, and then I might try to get into a little bit of the Cold War if we have time, but we're going to be kind of pressed for time here in our last week together virtually. Anyway, so one of the major consequences of World War II was this event we call the Holocaust. Now, it's a consequence that took place during the war, so it's not something that happened afterward, but it was a big part of what went on during the war and had lasting effects in the world. So let's talk about what the Holocaust is if you don't really know yet. Number the Stars touched on it a little bit, but not in full depth because our characters in Number the Stars were able to kind of avoid the full effect of the Holocaust because they were able to get to Sweden. All right, so your book titles it The Holocaust, Slaughter of the Weak and Unfit, because the Holocaust was a targeting of peoples that the Nazis, the Germans, considered to be weak or unfit for the world. They weren't as good as the Germans in the Germans' minds, and so that meant that they didn't need to live anymore. That was the Nazis' perspective. So World War II resulted in more than 50 million deaths total. So not just Holocaust specific, but overall, all of the war casualties, whether it was military, civilians, whatever, over 50 million deaths. That's a huge number. Well, over 11 million of those deaths, so that's over 20% of those deaths, were a result of the Holocaust, of Hitler's program to rid Germany of what he considered undesirable people. So who did he consider undesirable people? Jews primarily, but also blacks, homosexuals, socialists, communists, disabled people, gypsies. There was a lot of groups of people that he considered undesirable. Basically, if you were not German or of some sort of German descent, he didn't really like you very much. So this program, which we have come to call the Holocaust really is just a word for a major killing or destruction of something. But this program was set up by Hitler to systematically meaning he had a program in place. There was a system. It wasn't just random. He had a plan. Systematically murder these undesirables, which targeted, like I said, not only Jews, but also gypsies. Gypsies are a people group. They're sort of a religious group, but also just sort of like an ethnic group. They wander from place to place. The disabled, the terminally ill, homosexuals, Russians, Poles, Ukrainians, Czechs. So like I said, really, if you were not German or had some sort of German ancestry or cultural similarity, he wasn't a fan of yours and you were part of this program to kill. Now, Jews were the biggest group targeted. About 6 million out of the 11 million killed were Jewish people, but 5 million of those that died in the Holocaust were some of these other groups. So we tend to think of the Holocaust as just being Jews, and it was the majority. That's where the focus was, and that was kind of a whole separate angle of their program called the Final Solution to the Jewish Question. They had a whole idea of how they were going to get rid of specifically the Jews, but they were not the only ones targeted by Hitler. All right, so part of this program that probably doesn't get focused on as much as maybe it should, that your book really points out, is this euthanasia program that the Nazis had. If you're not familiar with the term euthanasia, that's basically medically assisted suicide. It's when you are injected with some sort of a chemical that will kill you. Some people argue that you should, as a person, be able to select to euthanize yourself. If you're ready to go, most people would argue that that's not an appropriate thing, that we should not do that, but euthanasia isn't just a term that the Nazis came up with. That's just a term. If you have, like, say, a pet that is really sick and can't be helped, sometimes we choose to put our animals down for their own good because they can't be helped. That's euthanasia. Okay, so just hoping you understand that concept. But the Nazis used euthanasia on humans without their consent. And they called it mercy killing because they liked to try to tell themselves that what they were doing was merciful, because they were targeting people that were disabled with this program. So Hitler used starvation, which that is not merciful. Starvation is not a good way to die. That's a long process. Starvation, lethal injection, meaning, like I said, some sort of poisonous chemical injected into your body, and also poison gas, another not pleasant way to go. None of these are particularly pleasant. So he used all of these different forms of euthanasia to try to rid Germany of people who were terminally ill. That means they have some sort of a sickness that is not going to be able to be cured, and those who were disabled. So handicapped, mentally handicapped, people that were born with different disabilities. So those were the ones that were targeted specifically in this euthanasia program, which the Nazis called mercy killing. And this program had the code name Operation T4. I'm not sure what the reasoning behind the T4 is. It might just have not a whole lot of meaning. It might have meaning, I'm not sure. But Operation T4 was this mercy killing program. And by 1940, the Nazis had constructed 6 centers to kill thousands of these people. So they had created these euthanasia centers. That is where they would send the terminally ill or the mentally disabled or the handicapped to be killed by these various methods that were mentioned. And it's estimated that about 200,000 people died from forced euthanasia. So out of these 11 million, 200,000 approximately of the terminally ill or disabled were killed via Operation T4. So that's probably a part of the Holocaust that you're not as familiar with. We tend to focus on what happened with the Jews specifically, but this is also a really, really tragic event of another group of people that were helpless, that were targeted. All right, so let's get into what is known as the Holocaust, or we're going to introduce to you what might be a new term, the Shoah. So Hebrew or Jewish people typically might use the word Shoah to refer to the Holocaust. So most often we use the term Holocaust to refer to the mass murder of Jews during World War II. However, many Jews use the term Shoah, which means calamity in Hebrew. A calamity is a big disaster, a tragic loss of life, a tragic event. So we usually use the word Holocaust, which also basically just means calamity or tragic disaster. But Shoah is the term that a lot of Jews will use. So Shoah and Holocaust are just synonyms that come from different languages. So the Nazis' goal in the Holocaust was to completely eliminate Jews from Europe. Now, we've talked earlier this year about anti-Semitism, this hatred toward Jewish people, and how it originated. I mean, it's been around for a long time, and we saw it in the Middle Ages with the plague. The Jews were blamed for the plague, and we've seen it pop up over time. We talked about the pogroms in Russia. And so this is just another very extreme example of anti-Semitism becoming a very focal point of history. So they did not succeed in their goal of killing every single Jew in Europe, but they came pretty close. They killed 6 million Jews during the Holocaust, and I believe that before the war there were about 9 million Jewish people living throughout Europe, so they killed approximately 2/3 of the Jewish population in Europe, so they were pretty successful in their goal, unfortunately. And this was, like we said before, this was systematic. This was not just random. They had a whole plan that they laid out. They actually had a meeting to decide, and this program of how they're going to go about getting rid of the Jewish population was known as the final solution, or the final solution to the Jewish problem. That is how the Germans and the Nazis referred to this, because they saw the Jews as a problem and they wanted to come up with a solution to the problem. And their solution was to put them in separate neighborhoods and then ship them off to death camps and kill them. So let's look through how this happened. Shortly after Hitler came to power in Germany, the Nazis began pressuring Jews to leave Germany. So that was kind of step one, was actually, we're going to make you feel uncomfortable in our country. We're going to limit your rights as a citizen. Something came out called the Nuremberg Laws that were passed, where it made it illegal for Jews to own businesses. You saw that in Number the Stars. They couldn't go to a lot of public places. They had to go to separate schools. Germans and Jews couldn't marry or associate with each other, really. So lots of laws came to be. And so they wanted to see if some of them would just leave Germany. And a lot of them did try, but a lot of them had been living there for so long that they considered themselves German more than they considered themselves Jewish, even some of them. And so a lot of them did not leave. And then there came a point where they no longer were allowing them to leave. And they were going to try to keep them there and kill them. And a lot of the reason as well why more of them didn't leave earlier on, more Jews didn't leave Germany, is because there were not a lot of countries that were accepting Jewish immigrants, the United States being one of them. The United States turned a lot of Jews away at this time. There's a pretty sad story about a ship that left from Germany. I think it was called the St. Louis, and they were supposed to go to Cuba. They had all gotten passage and they were supposed to go to Cuba. When they got to Cuba, Cuban officials had changed their minds. No, you can't come in. So they turn around, they try to go to the United States through Miami. The United States says no. So they have to go back to Europe. A lot of them were able to go to Britain or France instead of Germany, but some of them had to go back to Germany. And then because of the events that took place after that point in Europe, most of those Jews that were trying to leave Germany ended up back in Europe and ended up being killed in the Holocaust. So a pretty sad story about refugees seeking a place of safety and not being allowed to come anywhere else. All right, so they pressured Jews to leave Germany. Next, we talked about this. Germans boycotted Jewish businesses and forced them to sell their businesses. So if you're not familiar with the term boycott, that means you're not going to go to a certain place. So Germans boycotting Jewish businesses meant that they were no longer going to go to Jewish businesses. They were not going to buy things from Jewish businesses. So that was kind of the first step, and then eventually they just weren't allowed to own businesses anymore at all. And as part of this process, a very significant event takes place on November 9th and 10th, 1938. And pay attention to the date there, November 1938. World War II has not even started yet. So Hitler takes power in Germany in 1933. And so all of these events I've talked about so far, making the Jewish citizens feel uncomfortable, boycotting their businesses, that all starts to happen long before the war ever takes place. So if you think about it, World War II was a long war. It was 6 years. But there were 6 years of Hitler in power in Germany before World War II even happened. So 12 years of German history, there is Hitler in charge targeting the Jewish people. That's a long time to live under that kind of oppression. All right, so November 9th and 10th, 1938, there was a wave of pogroms that took place. We have learned this term before. I've already mentioned it here once. Pogroms, remember, that is a sweeping, targeted attack on Jewish people. Some people were killed, their businesses were destroyed, their books were burned, people were just abused and beaten up. Okay, remember that we talked about pogroms in Russia, so the same type of thing happens here in Germany now. So these set of pogroms took place against the Jews throughout Germany and Austria and the Sudetenland. Remember, those are the places at this point in 1938 that Hitler controls. And this event is referred to as Kristallnacht, which means in German, I believe. I think it's German. But whatever language it is, I know it means night of broken glass. So think about why they would call it Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. It's because they went around and they smashed a lot of Jewish businesses and synagogues, and they would throw their books written by Jews and burn them. It was a very violent 2 evenings that took place that really just threatened the Jewish population, and the Germans were letting them know that we are in control and we are going to do what we want, and you're not welcome here anymore. So Kristallnacht, a significant event there. All right, so soon from that point on, the Germans are going to force the Jews to relocate to ghettos. Now, we tend to use the word ghetto now just kind of as a fun slang word, but it was actually, it's a legitimate thing, and it does kind of mean the same thing that we mean it today when we use it. A ghetto is a poor neighborhood, essentially. So the Jews were forced to relocate to ghettos. So what they did was they would take a section of a city and they would fence it off, build a wall around it essentially, and say, this is now the Jewish section of town. All the Jews have to move into this area, and you're not allowed to go into the rest of the community. And it was a really bad situation. They were not kept well. There was not enough space. You would have multiple families living in small little apartments. There was usually not good sewage. There usually was not enough food. So a lot of times people just starved from the bad conditions in the ghetto or got sick and weren't able to get better. So living in the ghetto was pretty horrific in and of itself, but then it got even worse because they began to relocate people from the ghettos and they sent them to concentration camps. This might be a term you're familiar with. A concentration camp is basically a prison camp. The Jews were sent there to work, do things for the war effort, but really more than that, they were just really sent there to work themselves to death. And then there were some concentration camps that really were actually extermination camps. If you know what the term extermination means, it means to get rid of, to kill. So these death camps, these extermination camps, they were not even so much that they were going to work them to death. Some people did work, but a lot of people upon arriving at a death camp would immediately be killed. So like I said, eventually the Germans did not just have concentration camps, but they had extermination camps that were created for the sole purpose of killing the prisoners that arrived there. And most often, the people that arrived at extermination camps died by being gassed in gas chambers. So when they would first arrive at a at an extermination camp, they would be sorted into groups. If they looked relatively young and healthy, they might be kept at the camp to be used for different work purposes. If they were children, elderly, looked sickly at all, they would be sent immediately to the gas chambers under the guise that they were getting showers, but really they were going into a big room that looked like a big shower room, and gas came out of the faucets, not water. And once they had been killed from the poisonous gas, the gas that they used was called Zyklon B. After that, they were usually burned in crematoriums to get rid of their bodies. There were so many bodies, they couldn't really bury all of them, nor did the Nazis really care about doing that. So usually the bodies were burned. Sometimes they were burned in mass graves because they were killing so many people every day. I do want to apologize as well if I seem callous or hardened to this information. I've just done a lot of reading and research in this area, so this information I'm used to hearing about this information. And so I'm sorry if I'm like shocking you by what I'm saying, or if I'm shocking you by the fact that I don't seem shocked by what I'm saying. I've just read about it a lot. But it still is incredibly tragic, and still a lot of the time when I read firsthand accounts of people that lived through this, it's still incredibly moving when I stop to think about what actually took place and would I have been able to survive a situation like this? I don't think so. And so the people that survived this situation, it's just incredible the kind of strength that they have. All right. So there were lots and lots and lots of concentration camps all throughout Germany and Austria and Poland, but there were 6 camps that were specifically these extermination camps that were designed to kill. The most famous, or notorious, really famous for bad reasons, is the camp called Auschwitz, located in Poland. It was the largest of the camps. Its full name was Auschwitz-Birkenau, and there were several different kind of camp compounds there on the grounds. So it was the largest of these killing centers, and it has the distinction of having killed more people at that location than any of the other camps. Just at Auschwitz alone, I believe about 1.1 million people were killed. But there were a lot of other extermination camps too. Treblinka is the name of another one. Sobibor, I believe. And there are 3 others that I can't think of right now that were extermination camps. And then there were a lot of camps that were concentration camps. But don't even think that just because you weren't at an extermination camp and you were just at a concentration camp, that meant you were going to survive. You might have a better chance of surviving because maybe there weren't gas chambers there, or they weren't specifically trying to kill people right on arrival there. But plenty of people died in places other than the extermination camps, just because of horrible living conditions and horrible working conditions, being worked to death and starved. At least 1.2, I said 1.1, at least 1.2 million Jews were murdered at Auschwitz. Kind of an interesting thing to mention, very famously, the gates when you walk into Auschwitz, and I think many of the other camps as well, actually. I know for a fact at Dachau, because I have been there. Well, I didn't get to go inside, it was closed that day. But Dachau in Germany, which was the first concentration camp that was opened in 1933. So Dachau, Auschwitz, and I know many of the others, at the gates when you would walk in had this inscription, the sign that said in German, Arbeit macht frei, which means work makes you free. And just a super, I think, interesting thing that the Germans chose to do, and really ironic to give these people the idea when they walked in that if you just work hard, you'll eventually be freed. And I'm sure that's what they wanted the people to think, but it was definitely not true. Work would not make them free. The only thing that would make them free would be someone rescuing them, which did eventually take place when the Germans lost the war. And that's another interesting thing to mention. I don't think anyone really knows for sure how much the outside world knew. I think a lot of governments probably knew more than they like to say that they knew about what was going on. I think the German people definitely knew what was going on. But a lot of the soldiers that came to free these people from the camps, the Americans and the Russians, really had no idea. And can you imagine stumbling upon a concentration camp where there's just these skeletal bodies, people that are barely even alive anymore, or piles of corpses, and having to go in and free these people and figure out what's going on? I can't imagine witnessing that as a prisoner or as a soldier. It's hard to imagine. There's a lot I could talk about with the Holocaust that we don't really have time to. I might get into more of it next week, but these are just kind of the basics. Okay, normally I wouldn't be transitioning so quickly. I'd be showing you guys some videos or something. Next week I will post some videos that you guys can watch that aren't too graphic. I know we're all at different levels of what we can handle graphically, and I don't want to upset anyone, but it's so important that you guys are aware that this took place, because believe it or not, there are still people in our world today that say that the Holocaust did not take place. And if you don't think it's happened before, then why would you think it's going to happen again? We have to be aware that this is what we're capable of as humans, and we have to be aware that this has happened so that we can fight against it happening again, and so that the people that lived through this or did not live, that their memory goes on, and what they did matters in the long run. World War II now is getting to be a long time ago. I know, I'm sure for you guys it feels like forever ago. I used to think of World War II as like not being that long ago, but now, I mean, the war ended in 1945. I mean, we're looking at what, that's been like almost 80 years ago, 75 years. And so there's not that many Holocaust survivors or just World War II veterans or anything alive anymore. I mean, there are still some, but a lot of them are not still alive because they're older and they're dying. And so it's so important that we learn about this and know and let their memory live on. Okay. So this is a consequence of World War II that wasn't an after effect of World War II. It was happening during the war. But let's look at what some of the other consequences of World War II were, what happened after the fact. So there were political changes. As you can imagine, we talked about how World War I caused all of these fascist leaders and dictatorships to take place, and that's what happened. But a lot of what caused World War II to get started were the political leaders in charge, and so there's going to be political changes again after the fact. So by the end of World War II, Europe was crushed, and Europe's domination of the world had ended. So previous to this, countries like Britain, France, to a certain extent Germany, they were like kind of the major world powers at the time. But the war just really wrecked their economy. I mean, it wrecked their infrastructure. They had to rebuild. And the countries like Germany that were on the losing side, they were really in a bad place. And so it meant that Europe was not really the leading area of the world anymore. But instead, the United States and the Soviet Union, or Russia, were now the two dominant powers. This is so important for what happens after World War II. So the United States and the Soviet Union were two of the major Allied powers along with Britain. Well, Britain endured a lot of destruction from the Luftwaffe, the German army or Air Force bombing them, and their economy was pretty much sunk, so they were not in a good place after World War II economically. So that left the United States and the Soviet Union kind of being as the two major leading world powers that had won the war. And that is going to directly impact an event called the Cold War that takes place, and that's what chapter 19 is about. I don't think we're really going to have time to get into the Cold War this year, which makes me sad because that's one of my favorite things to talk about too, because so many things went on. So just really quickly, well, actually that leads us right into our next point, so we'll see what I say here in the notes. All right, so the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union were the two dominant world powers, had the most money, the most power, the most influence, directly impacts the fact that now we also have communism spreading and something called the Cold War. So the Soviet Union, you should know already from chapter 17 as well, was communist at this point. And so now that they are a leading world power after World War II, communism began to spread rapidly throughout the world because Joseph Stalin, oh no! My camera fell. Is it gonna stay now? Yikes. Sorry. Okay. All right, hopefully it stays now. I don't know. All right, so under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union took charge of most of Eastern Europe, all of that part of the world. They got power over. They took it on as their own territory after World War II. And so all of those nations became communist. They either became a part of the Soviet Union or they had their own governments, but they were what we call puppet governments, meaning they basically just did whatever the Soviet Union told them to do, and they really were under the control of the Soviet Union. Soviet forces, as we know, had invaded Poland just a couple days after Germany had during World War II. And they also had gone into all these other Eastern European countries as well. So they were fighting Germany's control, but they weren't fighting to free the people. They were fighting for control of the countries themselves. And so those states, those countries in Eastern Europe all became subject to the Soviet Union's influence and put communist governments in place in those countries. Britain and the United States quickly became aware of what Russia was doing in Eastern Europe and how they were trying to dominate world affairs and spread communism. Britain and the United States do not like this. They do not think it is a good idea that communism is spreading throughout the world. And so this leads to a time period known as the Cold War. Because we're not going to get into the entire Cold War chapter, we're going to talk a little bit about it now. So a Cold War is not an actual war. It's called a Cold War because it's not hot. There's not active fighting going on all the time, but it's like a standoff. So a Cold War is defined as a political rivalry that stops short of actual war. So it's kind of like the Soviet Union and the United States and Britain as well, but the United States was the bigger power at the time. They're in this fight. They don't get along and they're at this standoff. But they don't really want to engage in an actual war because we just came out of World War II. But they are going to constantly be going head to head. All of the political decisions that are made are going to have a direct relation to how it's going to affect the other country, and they're constantly trying to outdo each other and gain dominance over the other. So when you have kind of these two major world powers, they are kind of always just fighting for influence and dominance over the other, and that's what was going on in the Cold War. America and its allies aligned against the aggression of the Soviet Union and its communist allies. So you basically end up with what we would call the free world, America and those democratic or republican countries, capitalism, and then on the other side, Russia and all of the communist nations, and you get these kind of two major groups and I think I've mentioned in class before that the term third world country actually comes from any countries that didn't kind of fall in one of these two camps. They didn't align themselves either with the United States or the Cold War. They end up being called third world countries, and they kind of fall behind economically because they're not being supported by one of the two major powers. So it says we'll spend next chapter. I don't think will, unfortunately, this year. It's a bummer. But the next chapter, chapter 19, maybe you want to look at it on your own if you're interested, covers all the major events of the Cold War. The Cold War lasted from 1945 to 1991. That's the year I was born, okay? So it's not active fighting the whole time, like actual war with soldiers. Can you see the bottom of the screen? Okay, I think you can. But that is, let's see, almost 50 years of this tension. I think the Cold War could very much be described as it's a tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. And this leads to the thing again, I can't go into the whole thing, but this leads to the space race, if you're familiar with that term. The Soviet Union and the United States are constantly back and forth trying to one-up each other. Who's going to get to the moon first? Who's going to put a satellite up first? By the way, Russia beats us with a satellite first, but we beat them to the moon. That's constantly back and forth. Man, there's so much to talk about with the Cold War. I just shouldn't even get into it, but the Korean War and the Vietnam War are both actual real wars that were fought during the time period of the Cold War that were both related to the spread of communism. So pretty much all of the decisions politically that were made during this time by the United States were, is this going to help us stop spreading communism? Is it going to stop the spread of communism? That was kind of what they were after at this point. So the Korean War was fought to keep Korea from being communist. That one didn't really have a winner or a loser, as you know. Or maybe you don't know, but if you don't know, Korea is not just Korea, it is now North Korea and South Korea. North Korea is communist, South Korea is not, and that's a result of the Korean War fought during the Cold War period. And then there was also the Vietnam War, which was fought over the same thing, essentially. Vietnam, there was communist China coming down into Vietnam, trying to make the whole nation communist. United States says, nope, we're gonna come in and fight and try to prevent the communism from spreading. And that war went on for a long time with not any real definitive winners or losers, but in the end, all of Vietnam became communist. So kind of more of a loss for us in our goals, at least. All right, that's a major tangent, a peek into chapter 19. Yeah. All right. Cold War, major, probably the biggest consequence of after World War II was it led to this 50-year time period known as the Cold War, and World War II had brought about the political environment for the Cold War to take place. All right. Another consequence of World War II was disillusionment, and this was kind of a consequence of World War I as well. People realized, wow, we are sinners, and the world is hopeless, because without the truth and the hope of the gospel, it's a bleak reality here on earth, because sin is everywhere. All right, so there was a sense of despair and hopelessness that resulted after World War I, and it continued after World War II. I mean, think about it. If you were alive for both of these time periods, you went through World War I, and then there's the Great Depression, and now we're in World War II. All of this within a 30-year time period. That's not a happy 30 years. So of course, without the hope of the gospel, you're surely feeling quite hopeless about what's happening in the world. And so likewise, the art and literature that came out during this time period reflected that sense of despair or disillusionment. Disillusionment means you're looking out at what's happening in the world and you're saying to yourself, this is not good, I don't have hope, I don't think there's a bright future for us. That's kind of how I would describe disillusionment. So So one of the famous painters from this disillusioned time period was the American painter Jackson Pollock. He developed a type of painting known as abstract expressionism. So if you're familiar at all with abstract art, this might be what you think of. If you still have your book out, page 341 shows Jackson Pollock painting, and his paintings kind of just look like he took a brush and just like splashed a bunch of random stuff on there, which kind of reflects this kind of like chaotic, disillusioned feeling. So that's abstract expressionism. Pollock created many of his paintings by randomly splashing paint onto a canvas. So both the First and Second World Wars smashed the fantasy that man is by nature good and born without sin. So for a while there, people were starting to think that, hey, we're not so bad. We've been improving our lives. Things have been getting better in the world. Look at all these inventions we're coming up with. Man is by nature good. That was kind of that romanticism idea we talked about, trust your heart. Well, the First and Second World Wars kind of wiped that idea out and said, no, we're not by nature good. By nature, we're capable of mass killing and destruction. Oh, well, I don't know how I got out of the whole screen, but that's the end of the chapter. I'm sure there are some things in this last section that were in your book that we didn't talk about. Remember, that is a summary overview of the chapter that we have in our notes, but you have a chapter review, 2 chapter review exercises to do, 2 pages in your workbook, 151 and 152, I believe. And so there might be a couple, I think most of it is covered in here, but there might be a couple things that you need to look at in your book, or maybe in the videos if you're still watching the BJU Press videos. But that has been chapter 18. Next week you can review some more and finish up with your test. And I will probably provide some more information about the Holocaust, just because I usually spend a lot more time on it than I have today. But yeah, chapter 18, World War II. I enjoyed being able to actually teach you for a chapter. If I had my mind wrapped around the distance learning thing and wasn't so overwhelmed at the beginning of this all, I probably could have taught you the other chapters as well, but it was helpful to me to be able to utilize the Bob Jones videos, and I hope that it worked out okay for you as well. But yeah, hope you enjoyed the World War II chapter. It's my favorite chapter in the book. So this has been chapter 18.